All right, Gordo, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Good. Good to make the connection.
It's indeed good to make the connection. We've been exchanging mainly on Twitter for some time now, and yeah, it was a cool opportunity to get you on the podcast and talk about some topics that I've had on my mind. Reading what you post and then listening to some other podcasts that you've done. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
For the few listeners that maybe don't know who you are, could you give us a brief intro, Gordo? Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah. So, let's just start right at the beginning. I was working in finance in Hong Kong, and I got into ultra running and climbing. And ultimately, that led me to triathlon. And around the time of my 30th birthday, I signed up for an Ironman, started doing triathlon, and just got faster and faster and faster. And ultimately, I was able to take myself to several podiums on the international circuit. My fastest race was an 8:29 in Ironman Canada, running a 2:46 off the bike, which was an absolutely amazing result for me, basically coming off the couch in my mid-20s. It was really surprising. It was a lot of fun. And then in my early 40s, I had 3 young kids and I decided to take a break from racing. And I stayed active, but I didn't train. I just, kept it ticking over. And here I am, 53, and I've made a decision after 10 years of not racing to come back and to apply everything I learned when I was younger, as well as apply. There's been some movement in the science and in our understanding of physiology in the 10 years that I was away. And I'm really applying that with my old knowledge and my understanding of my own body to get myself back in shape and to see how fast I can go again.
That's really exciting. And we'll get to the training talk. I have quite a few questions loaded up for you on that topic. I wanted to start somewhere else with you, and that is around sharing on the internet and social media in general. When did you have a for people who don't know, you have a very prolific blog that you write, that you have been writing for a long time. So when did you start sharing your thoughts online and why?
From the very beginning. So I started as a clueless lurker. And this is like Web 1.0, when we were all on message boards in the late 90s. There were no graphics, it was text only. And I would just lurk on Rec Sport Triathlon, which is what it was called back then, and just listen in and try and learn. My fitness, my training was the best part of my life when I was working in finance. So I had this job that I spent a lot of time at, but in terms of what gave me passion and energy, it was training. So I was so into it. So reading books, asking questions, just soaking it all up. And then I came across a book, Joe Friel's Triathlon, the Triathlete's Training Bible. That was it. And Joe wasn't coaching me at the time. It was in my first season of Ironman racing, and I read it. And then in my second season, I applied it, and wow, it worked so great. And along this whole period, I'm blogging and sharing, and I had a little website and just really explained to people what I'm doing. And we were at the cutting edge of sharing this stuff online because nobody else had really started doing it. So there was a ton of interest and just a lot of positive feedback to me, and a lot of new connections, exactly like what this year's been like, except now the network is so big. You're talking millions of people you can connect to. So the ramp is even quicker in terms of getting reach and connecting to people, which is a lot of fun.
What are the upsides from your perspective today using social media to share thoughts, and potentially its downsides?
So the upside is absolutely amazing. I can put something out there to a world-class coach physiologist in Finland. And 24 hours later, he's replying to me with graphics, advice. And I mean, it's just phenomenal to me. I mean, there's no way I could have done that 20 years ago. The other thing is there's so much quality data out there. I mean, if I'm wondering to myself, okay, well, what is world class at 53? Well, you just get on Strava, do a little poking around, and you can look at it. You can look at 3 years of somebody's training that you're racing. You can pull the files in. You can even ask them questions, and they'll tell you what's going on. So it's a much more open. I think the learning curve is much quicker. The drawback is there's a lot of noise out there. So when you're if I think back to myself 25 years ago when I was completely clueless about my own physiology, about what works, there's so much noise. So it's really easy, I think, for a new athlete to get pulled in many different directions. And as a result, they never give one protocol enough time to work on their body. And as a result, they don't know what's working for them because they're always changing what they're doing. So I think that can be a challenge. I think a lot of the other challenges that people talk about the negative vibe on certain social media platforms, that you just need the discipline to curate your feed. I operate a one strike, you're out policy. Unless it's a friend of mine, then I try and figure out what they were trying to tell me. But for strangers, if somebody's having a bad day and they want to rip on you, you don't need to engage with them. You don't need to turn it into something. Other than that, it's a big net positive for me. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, like you said, I think if you have the discipline to put the drama aside, because there's enough if you look for it. But if you're disciplined enough to not get pulled into this, there's so much to be gained from it and to share through it as well. For coaches that use those platforms as learning opportunities, do you have a process that you follow when you encounter a new piece of information? You're not sure, is it wrong, is it right, is it valid or not? What is your process to kind of make sense of things and see where that piece might fit in your puzzle?
Use it on yourself. That would be, I know my physiology. I got over 20,000 hours of aerobic training in my body. So I come across something, I think it makes sense, try it out on myself, but also be aware that there are different physiology types. So if something doesn't work on me, it doesn't necessarily mean it's invalid. An example would be the approach to intensity, the severe domain, higher intensity. There's a very big range of response depending on the athlete profile when you're using the severe and extreme domains. I need to be very careful with that type of work, always have. Somebody else, say my daughter, who's very similar to me, she's got at least half my DNA, but she's got a very different profile. She responds and can handle a completely different training mix than me. And so we just need to be aware of that and not reject things outright, which brings me to another point, a larger point about protocol. When you see two successful coaches completely at loggerheads, so disagreeing about a protocol or an approach, it's not the approach. You can toss that issue to one side. Nobody's right there. Both coaches are right. And you don't need to pick a side. What you learn from that situation is it's not about that particular issue. And I'll give you some examples. So we just talked about intensity. Another one where you see people, feel very strongly, might be strength training. Some people are like, we never strength train. Now, the smart coaches will say, we never strength train because we don't think it helps us. It's not because we think it's wrong. And then other coaches will say, well, you got to strength train. Well, it's a thing where it really just depends on the athlete, the profile, what else you got going on. But there's many issues like this. And something I brought to my coaching and my team was if an athlete had something they wanted to do or something they wanted to take or some sort of recovery protocol, providing it was benign, I would never intervene. I just let them do it. I would never discourage somebody from doing something that I think didn't really work if they thought it worked, because maybe it works for them. And also maybe we're going to learn something too over time.
As long as the athlete doesn't go and hurt themselves or do something that's actually we know is going to be a net negative, we have to also give them the leeway to explore different options, like you said, for themselves, and figure out the good from the bad. Is there any specific options, modalities, when we talk about recovery, that you have seen work on some very well and not at all on others, so that are kind of up for grabs in terms of you have to try it to see if it works for you?
I'm pretty simple with recovery. I think having worked with a lot of athletes, I think almost everybody can get faster on the same amount of training if they focus on some basics. And by basics, the number one thing is sleep. Most working athletes aren't sleeping enough. So, I mean, it's just turn your alarm off and wake up when you wake up. And if you tell yourself, well, I'm never going to wake up if I do that, it kind of answers the question for you, right? Because obviously you're sleep deprived. There's no way you can get out of bed without an alarm. So there's a performance boost from just doing your same program, but changing your life so you get a bit more sleep. Another one, big one, age group athletes always traveling around the world for races. Every time you cross a time zone, every time you drive more than 90 minutes, you make yourself tired in a way that's not specific to getting better at your sport. So race local. And one of the things I tell people and my own kids is we're not going anywhere until you can beat every person within a 90-minute drive of our house, because we don't need the competition. You gotta race local and just stay put and train. And that's where the gains come from. And then the third one is just travel in general, going in and out of airports, long commutes. I really don't like spending time in the car because it's non-specific fatigue. Get rid of as much of that as possible. I got a video coming next week on that on my YouTube channel, just explaining how to get faster on the same amount of training, because there's a lot of gains to be had at that level, rather than trying to figure out how to cram more stress into our lives.
I like what you touched on here, the travel. A travel day is not a rest day. I think Niels van der Poel talked about this on his podcast with Steven Seiler, and it echoes what Matt Fraser also used to say when he was, training to. He won 5 CrossFit Games in a row, and he said the same thing. I hate traveling because it distracts me from training. If I'm home, I know I go to the gym, I train, I come home, I eat, I go train, and I, rinse, repeat. But as soon as I have to travel, it just throws things off and it distracts me from the actual work that I need to put in.
Yeah, very much so. As an elite, what we used to do in the winter is we would go down to the southern hemisphere, one location, and we would live close to the pool, and we would stay put and train for 13 weeks. And it would set up the whole year. After the 13 weeks, we would do a race, Ironman New Zealand usually. That would go great because everybody would be coming in from the northern hemisphere, and they didn't have that same block of base training. And then the rest of our year would be really set up from that 13-week block of doing nothing but just staying put.
Since we're in the topic of recovery, one question that I got from Twitter, if I'm not mistaken, was for older athletes who struggle with recovery, is it worth alternating long and short days, or better to be consistent every day with a given duration?
Okay, that is a great question.
It's not mine.
I've done both.
Okay.
So let's talk about when those approaches make sense. Mm-hmm. So I'm in my mid-40s, and I got 3 young kids at home, and it's just damage limitation, damage control. My life's chaotic. My schedule's all over the place. I'm just juggling. And I'm using an alarm to get out of bed in the morning. I'm a little short on sleep. In that situation, I used to call it low standard deviation training. So just get a workout every single morning, cardio or strength. And that way, you know that no matter what happens in your day, you got your training done. You did something for yourself. You tick the box. And because if you leave it late, you miss it. And you can't take a zero in that situation for your health, for stress management. You got to get something done. So that's where the low standard deviation approach works. And then if you get a slot in the afternoon or an opening in the evening, you do a secondary session, and that's just a total bonus. And then whenever you get a gap, an open morning, a weekend day or something, you can go longer and easier on top of that. And no racing, no supplemental stress. That's what I did. And it was all just about moving, lifting weights, having fun, getting outside, ideally something with my wife. Worked great. It's not a high performance plan though. It's a kind of get through until you're able to train in a more structured way, more properly. So now let's come on to the variation approach. So you mentioned Niels, howtoskate.se. Everybody needs to read that manifesto.
Yeah.
It is basically, those guys took everything that I learned and made it better. And he lays it out clearly and concisely, does a really good job of explaining what it takes if you've got ambitious goals to try and get to the top of a sport. So let's talk about the 5-2 in that 5-day microcycle, 2 days back-to-back recovery. I think we can learn a lot from that. Now, most of us are not going to be able to load 5 days in a row. Even Niels couldn't load 5 days in a row. If you look in the appendix in the back, that's where he got to eventually. But in the early days, actually, even the summer before, he was really fast. 41% of his days were light days or off days. And so that's important for a regular person to remember. There's going to be more rest than just these 2 off days. So what I've been finding is that in my week, it's 3 or 4 loading days. And those days are bigger than usual. And what you want to watch is you want to watch and decide what too big is for a loading day. I think often we say, my metrics are green, it's time to load, so I'm going to smash myself silly today, and then I'm going to blow my heart rate variability is going to tank 1 or 2 days later, and I'm going to be blowing myself out the floor. So in aiming for the variability and load, I'm going to be crashing through the floor of my recovery metrics and how I'm measuring if I'm coping. So it's overload, but you need to be prudent with the overload. And the way I encourage people to think about it is think along a 1,000-day time horizon, a very long time horizon. So it's not what I can handle this week, it's what I can handle chronically. So these little bits of overload. And so it's like this 1% better concept that you'll hear many coaches talk about. I'm not trying to move myself 10% with 1 day. I'm just trying to move myself a little bit with that day, recover, do it again. And as I layer the weeks on, the accumulated load rather than the 1 day load will be what's driving my gains going forward and driving these positive changes to physiology that we want to make. And I think, so that's the variability. Now, to put some scale into that for people, if your average, including all your rest days, is 100 points, however you're going to measure it, miles, time, whatever you're using, if your loading day is 150, so maybe 50% above the average, that's going to give you an appropriate stimulus, and it's probably not going to push you like through the floor. And so it's a series of that 3 or 4 of those types of days a week, combined with your easier days and maybe one or two maintenance days, will get you a nice progression over time, that variability. Now, the challenge with this approach, and the thing that I find hardest about it, is I wake up in the morning and I don't really know what my plan is. I know I'm going to exercise, but I don't know how much I'm going to exercise until I get into the day, until I check my metrics, my passive and my active metrics, and I decide where my body's at. So if you're an introvert and you don't mind training alone all the time, it's okay. But if you're part of a squad or you're part of a team and you're doing group training, it's going to require exceptional humility not to hit yourself when you're tired. And you're going to really need to communicate with your friends and your coaches if you've got somebody on deck with how you want to do this approach. Now, the way I dealt with it as an elite was I trained best with amateurs, because when I needed to go easier, I had the capacity to go easier in the group. And that's something else that I share with people is usually if you're in a group situation, the only person getting the correct workout is the strongest person in the group. Everybody else is going too intensely because they don't have this reserve that they can manage what they need. Everybody else is just hanging on because they want to train with a couple pro cyclists or something, and the pro cyclists are riding around doing their workout, but everybody else is getting throttled. So you need to be aware of that. And normally 3 people is a really good group, I find, in terms of if you've got 3 people thinking the same way and you're doing your training together, you can get the company and the kind of the dynamic in terms of connection and supporting each other. But if you're on the same page, you're not trying to kill each other. And I think that's what we see a lot in triathlon circles is these small groups of age groupers and elites, and they work really well together. And that can be a way to be held accountable. But also when you got to go easier, it's not like you're putting the relationship on the line. You can just back off.
What you just mentioned reminded me of, I believe it was Luke Way who said that. Luke coaches Jameson Plus and Brock Hull up in Canada. And I remember him telling me about how when he got someone who was really good, he would usually put them leading the camps for the youngsters. So those people would have to ride all day. And like you said, they would ride all day, but very, very slowly. And because they were never really in such a group before, the stimulus was really, really potent, especially at the beginning. It's just not the type of training they would have done by themselves, right? Niels had the conviction that I'm just going to go ride for 7 hours all week long. And this is just how it's going to be because I can, like you said, 1,000 days, I can trust the process. And I know that in 2 years, in 3 years, I'm going to be where I need to be. But it takes a whole lot of commitment to see that, right? It's essentially the opposite of instant gratification. And I feel like there's quite a bit of this in the training world today. It's all about that workout, right? You need that workout to be the magic thing. You need that workout. And I evolve in CrossFit circles a lot. And it's very much about this hard workout today is going to make me better. And if I'm not dying a bit more tomorrow, then it wasn't good enough and I need to go harder. And it's almost like there's a short-sightedness of it's got to happen now instead of trusting that the time and the work and the volume and the process, right?
There is the trust and related to the trust, something you'll hear many coaches and athletes talk about is the power of belief. And that, if you believe in the plan, you believe in your coach, the coach believes in the athlete, it's much more powerful in the whole training, because I think it just comes to the adaptations from being more relaxed, and it works great. It gets easier with time. Smart train, I think, a lot of the people that are in a rush are relatively new. I think once you've been around, if you can just keep yourself in the sport for 3 to 7 years, you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to see that ultimately it's about doing the work. It's about getting work done over time and avoiding long gaps and injuries and things that cause these step down functions. And, the gains are gradual, but the downs can be pretty quick in a month or two if you can't train. So you just let these little gains kind of keep rolling in your life and building up for you.
Continuing on the 5-2 topic, one thing that I picked out of your conversation with Rich Wall, which was good, by the way, the term that you mentioned is radical recovery. and also how that related to your own career and potentially some regrets that you had about that. Could we talk about this?
Yeah, and that's something. So that's a big change from 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, we thought that if we were resting, we were giving an unfair advantage to our competition. And so we did a lot. And it was great to see Niels lay it out there. And he did a lot too. And everybody does a lot at that level. So that, you know, I look at everybody, if you don't know training, you look at that book, you'd say, wow, he did so much. If you know training, you look at the book, you say, yeah, he did a lot and he did it very well. And so then you go the next step. Well, okay, well, what's different? And what was different was the amount of rest that he gave his body from those tough sessions. And I was talking about it with Johan earlier this week. And he said, you know, one of the issues they had is when things were going really well, they felt like they might have been resting too much. Like, do we really need to take the 2 days off? We're trying to break the world record here. And they made a decision, well, it's working. And Johan's familiar with my background and my training partner's background, where we basically went straight off a cliff because our body stopped recovering. And it's like, we don't want to push it anymore. We're going to keep the rest in there. And that was courageous, I think, to do something that different that involved not training. And I think that you have to think that is part of what enabled the phenomenal training. You know, 8 hours a week at 400 watts is a lot for a human, any human, to be able to do more than once. And then he backed it up with the specific prep that he did as well, which was phenomenal too. No skater had ever skated like that. So it was this massive aerobic base in that. So stepping back from that, because I'm not going to be throwing up elite performance anytime again for the rest of my life. But I was like, you know what? If these guys can do this much rest and still be world class, I can probably get away with resting, and it's not going to hold me back. And that's what it's about. It's about using the technology now, the heart rate variability, as well as some sub-maximal active readiness tests in the moderate domain, just a progressive test. I do one on the bike, and Johan does one running. And basically it's Niels's warm-up workout, but it's scaled down for somebody with my power. So that's where we got it from. Then we do a little bit of a sprint afterwards to see what kind of heart rate response we get. And the two metrics give me a view on how I'm coping. And if I'm not coping, or if I'm at the lower end of my normal range, I don't get to load. It's just the way it is. And it's working great in base training. Now, what I haven't kind of proven to myself yet is there will come a time when I think it's appropriate to train tired. And I want to answer that question for myself. I know I can train too tired, and I know I spent years doing it. But the idea is, you know, well, when might I want to train tired? And that might, you know, when am I willing to take a chance? My experience with coaching Ironman athletes is you want to do that kind of in the 2 to 7 week window before your event. That's where it might make sense to take a little bit of a risk. And if you're going to take a risk with volume, you're probably going to do it more 4 to 11 weeks out, because you don't want to tip yourself over the edge too close to the race, because you won't have enough time to recover. And then you'd end up over resting into the race. You would have lost the benefit from the extra volume. So that's something that's still kind of to be determined, and just kind of figure out how we're going to do it. Johan and I were working together when he was getting ready for the Otilo swim run championships, which is held at the beginning of September. And he got pretty tired end of July, early August. But fortunately, he didn't get too tired. So, you know, he was going into the race, took a few chances with the preparation, and it kind of paid off for him. So there's a risk return. right now in the Northern Hemisphere, most of us are a long way away from our competitive season, and certainly a very long way away from our goal races. And in that case, I would say be prudent and understand that you can take more recovery than you think you need. And recovery doesn't necessarily mean sitting on the couch. That's something, there we go, earlier. What's something about recovery that is highly variable? Mm-hmm. I would say the nature of your recovery is variable. So 100-watt ride for a male athlete. So it's low enough that you're not getting any real aerobic stimulus, but you're getting perhaps a recovery stimulus. That would be an example. I tend to tolerate easy swimming now that I'm back into a little bit of swim shape. Mm-hmm. I can swim, and it actually lifts my recovery. Some people prefer just walking, a very easy day. So understanding what works for you. Others like to go to a yoga class, particularly floor work in a room that's warm but not hot. That can lift people. So knowing the types of things that lift you, you can build those into your recovery days to get more out of them.
And it goes together with the idea of being more patient, having a longer term outlook on your performance, and not trying to maximize every second that you're going to put into it, because like you said, that the goal is months and months away. And if we're too hasty at the start, we're not going to get where we want to go, right?
Yeah, and I would, Niels in the book, so they said something, finish everything strong. So for Niels, that was, I want day 5 of my 5-day cycle to be a good day. That's how I'm going to judge if I was successful. Take that philosophy into everything you do. Every workout, every week, every month, every race, finish strong. So because it's particularly, well, in any event, it's really difficult at the start to understand how you're going to feel in the middle and towards the end, even an experienced athlete. I mean, if I said to you, hey, Sean, how are you going to feel in 5 hours? You're like, I got no idea how I'm going to feel in 5 hours. Well,
no clue.
Yeah. So, I mean, in Ironman, how am I going to feel 100K into the bike? And I'm sitting on the beach and I'm about to kick off. You have no idea. And so training yourself to understand that the way I feel now might not necessarily be the way I feel later, and to build that patience into everything. So the season, the workout, your long days, it can be, if you're a ultra endurance athlete, an endurance athlete, and I think it really applies to anything, but just to build this, don't be in a rush to get to the difficult bits, is how a friend of mine, Justin Dare, says. It says, when you're new or you get stressed out, you can be in a hurry to make it difficult. Well, it'll get difficult on its own. Just let it unfold, let it happen.
And I guess that goes together with the idea of, I guess it's got to be pretty freeing too, when you switch perspective and you start embracing the fact that it's going to be a long road. We're going to get there eventually. And like you said, we don't need to make things hard day one, because we won't last the 300 days to get to where we want to go.
Yeah, well, someday I hope that anyone listening will realize in their athletic journey that there was actually nowhere to get to. All you were doing the whole time was passing time. You were spending time, ideally doing something you like, but there is no destination. There's no rush. There's nowhere you're going to get to, because the benefit you're getting is from having the capacity to continue doing the exercise day to day. Staying in the game is winning. And it's easier to see in your friends that lose the ability to stay in the game, and seeing what they lose. Particularly somebody like me, my mental health really benefits from being able to exercise and be outside. And when you take that away from me, my life just isn't as good. So the benefit although it's nice to be able to show gains and demonstrate progress, but the benefit comes from the process. There's no destination with athletics. And that can be a tough thing in the transition when you're going elite back to amateur and you're coming out of your elite racing. You've lost, in a sense, the destination. You have to figure out, well, what am I going to do now? And as a coach, you can impart this knowledge to your team, particularly the members of your team that have this mental health benefit from staying in the game, and help them avoid making the mistakes or being able to see the patterns that might cause them to make themselves sick from exercise and losing the benefits that they get from being able to participate.
That's something I could have used a few years ago. I trained very, very hard, and not in a very intelligent way, but very hard nonetheless, for a 2K row. It was an indoor competition. I trained for probably 7-8 months prepping for it. And yeah, I wasn't aware of you're going to get to the top of that hill and then you're going to look over the other side. And there's a big, long way down before you start climbing again. I have never felt so powerless the week following that competition. It's just the emotional buildup, the physical fatigue, the nervous, everything was gone. And I was so lost in that week after the competition. Later, I realized that, like you just said, it's about the path, not the destination. And after the hill, there's just maybe a little way down or a long way down, and there's probably another uphill at some point. But if you just get too attached to the top of the mountain, eventually you have to look down the other side.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that too. So this sensation of going off a cliff is one that we run into a lot with ultra distance. You're in the buildup, in the many months of preparation, your neurochemistry gets used to what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So it gets used to your whole body's used to a lot of exercise. And that's why I think it's important for athletes, any sport, to maintain some sort of routine in their transition season that follows a competitive season. Your body is used to moving, it's used to being outside, it's used to the care and attention you pay to your nutrition. So if we get to the end of our A race and then we start partying all night and drinking and eating cake and doing whatever people do, you're putting a tremendous stress on your body that it's not used to. And even though your training stress has dropped, it's a stress.
Stress is stress.
And something else is, if you're an athlete, not training is a stress. Not exercising is stressful for people that are used to exercising. Mm-hmm. So if somebody tells you, well, you can just do whatever you want, but by the way, I think you shouldn't exercise because you just finished your competitive season, I'd say that's a mistake. It was a mistake for me in my competitive career. What's much better is keep it moving. Get yourself some sunlight. Keep the quality of your nutrition up, and just let your body come down naturally from this peak, this physiological peak. But and that'll slow the rate of decline. You need a decline, and you need a washout. I'm gonna have a bit of water here.
Go for it.
So you need that decline, particularly if you want to like stack up multiple seasons. But don't just let yourself come off a cliff.
I guess that goes together with the idea also of you have to give yourself the opportunity to decondition yourself to some extent so that your body is ready to accept the load again, right? I was talking to a friend of mine, his name is Pat Davidson, and he was talking about this idea of block -1, as in, what do you do the training block to prepare for the following one and to essentially enhance your body's ability to respond to the stimulus that you're going to be applying. So I think he was talking about nutrition and how just before he's going to go in a weight loss phase, he'll push his calories as high as he can on the maintenance side, but edging them up so that his body is really ready for the opposite stimulus when the time comes. And I guess that transition period is also very important in the sense of giving the opportunity to the body of, letting go a little bit. You talked about that downslope, so that we can go back up again. And there's something to respond to, because if we just keep on hammering all the time and never stop, at some point the body says, no, thank you.
Yeah. And let's dig in. Some people might not want to hear this, but a year is not a long enough cycle. A relatively quick cycle might be 18 months. And athletes, particularly amateur athletes that are trying to peak 3 or even 4 times a year, they never get anywhere close to their potential, because they're seeking these multiple peaks within a year, within a season. So what I recommend people do is I recommend they dial into, well, hey, what's your natural peak? And what do I mean by that? Well, if you pay attention and you train for multiple years, you're going to notice a pattern in your fitness. And myself, my peak is end of August, early September. That's when I tend to do best. And that was even the case when I was changing hemispheres to have decent weather for my outdoor cycling. Other athletes I coached had peaks in May. And no matter what we did, the best race that athlete ever had was in May, year in, year out. Learn your peak and work with that. Don't try and work against your natural cycles, because it's got something to do with your personal physiology as well as your environment, what you got going on around you and in your life. So I think that is one way to deal with it, is to, again, it's an example of broadening that time horizon. So you're not always in a rush. And then related to that is race when you're ready to race, compete, let your physiology drive your competitive season, as opposed to laying all these events out in the calendar and deciding, okay, I'm going to peak there. So get yourself to the point where you're really fit, you're ready to go, and then go do it. And understand that if you do find yourself in a situation where your form is spectacular, get out there and go do a race. Use it in a way. Now, if you're an Olympic athlete, you don't get to choose the day they're going to set the Olympics. So that is very challenging, is to peak on a very on a day in a foreign country with all different stuff. That's a whole different thing. But most of us aren't dealing with that. Most of us have that flexibility where we can race when we're fit, and we can control our competitive season rather than letting it control us. And coming back, that's something I did really well, is I haven't been in a rush to get back to racing, because the race itself, I call it the tyranny of the race schedule, can nudge you into doing training that your body's not ready for, because you think you need to start doing that training to get ready for your race.
There's that, and the idea also that for any given competition, and I see that a lot in the amateur CrossFit world, for any competition that you decide to sign up for, whether it's a 1, 2, or 3 day event like they have now pretty much all summer long, or from anywhere from April to November, you'll find a competition if you want to. For every week that or every competition that you partake in, you lose the week before and the week after at the very least. So for every time you compete, you lose 2 weeks of development, is essentially how I put it. And if you're trying to line up every weekend because you want to compete and you love competing, and it's great. I mean, it's great that people want to and are think that they can do, but at the end of the day, you might spend the whole season competing, but did you actually improve compared to where you were 6 months ago?
Yeah, I listened to a podcast about Nordic skiing. And the coach was saying, actually, the best the best development happens in the athletes just below the national class level, because they're very good, but they're not on the national team, so they can do half the races and they can continue to develop themselves. Now, I mentioned my 13-week block in the Southern Hemisphere where we would stay put and train. So what we would do is the training was primarily base training oriented. So almost all moderate domain, a little bit of heavy domain work. But what we would throw in just as a session would be a short race, an aquathon or a time trial or a shorter triathlon. And we would just treat it like a workout. And so we would get that stimulus and we would be able to practice our race skills, but we wouldn't have this big unload recovery afterwards. It would just be, the ideal dose is somewhere between a half hour and an hour long of higher intensity. And you're kind of moving back and forth between the heavy and severe domains. It's kind of sort of like a crisscross workout. And then you just, you have an easier day the next day, and then you're back into your training. And so there's not much of a loss in terms of overall load within your week. That can be a great way for people to handle it. CrossFit should do like half competitions or something for the athletes, or like a quarter dose, so you can, it doesn't cost you. So you can go in, you get the competitive skills, you get the competitive dose, but it doesn't make you so tired that you got to freshen up and do it for that. And I imagine some of the teams must do that informally with themselves. I mean, that's how we handled it. If there wasn't a race on, we just do a race with ourselves within the week.
Yeah, it's obviously better if you can control the environment. The difficulty, though, is that showing up at a competition, knowing you're not gonna either go absolutely all out or not treat it like you're in it to win it, from the competitors that I've spoken with. And granted, it's still, I would say, a young sport, and I'm not taking anything away from the competitors by saying that. It's just that maybe that there's a lot of principles that we already see broadly applied in older, quote unquote, disciplines that haven't transferred over yet to this very young sport.
Well, let's talk about that, because that you bring up a great point. And when I lay out my athlete seasons, and even with my kids, we're looking for three types of races, three types of competitive environments. We want a competitive environment where the athlete is going to shine. So we want an environment where they're going to be relatively strong and they're going to have a shot at winning. And so they're going to learn the skills that are required to win. And they're going to also have a positive experience. And an example of that for a kid is summer league swimming. It's a lot of dual meets. My kids get a ribbon. They're all happy. Gets that early positive experience, not just for kids. If you're a new athlete, it's about staying in the game. You got to find a way to give yourself this early positive experience. Next level, you're going to be in a competitive environment with people at your own level. And, cycling has A, B, C, D grades, Cat 1, Cat 4, Cat 3. Different sports approach this differently. But the idea is you're going to be in a race where the outcome isn't really known. And you might have a shot, but it's going to have to be a really good day. And you're going to be pushed and you're going to learn some different skills. Third type of race, very important for childhood stars or people that are naturally talented. You're going to go into a race and you're going to get your butt kicked. And you're going to learn that you got a lot of work to do if you want to be decent. And I had a friend who used to come in and out of Boulder. So rather than doing races, he would change his training environment because the level here in Boulder is so high in triathlon. He'd come in and after 6 weeks, he's like, I'm never going to win a race. And then he would go home and he'd be crushing everybody. And it's kind of like, okay, there's hope. And so he would cycle it in and out by using his training environment. And I think that's what some federations do with these training camps is they bring everybody together. The idea is you lift them, send them back home, or they're back to being all-stars. But as a recreational athlete, as an amateur athlete, you still need to be giving yourself these different levels of competition. It's different skills, and it also will work towards your motivation, both to keep working and also to give yourself some successes.
And it's also having the, again, we come back to discipline of putting yourself through those different environments to keep progressing, of the ones that are just right for you, the ones where you know you're going to be on top, and the ones you know you're not going to be. But again, it takes putting the ego aside, because I guess if I was just thinking about it like that, hey, I'm going to compete, I'm going to just pick the ones where I know they're big enough that the prestige is there and that everything that goes with it is there, maybe even surprise money and whatnot. And I can probably win it. But I love what you said, because I feel it takes, I guess, the maturity that you have from your training years and coaching years to come up with, hey, no, the competition is not, it's not just the competition. There's not one kind, and there's different degrees, and we have to play with that as well to keep developing. And it's not just, hey, there's competition written down, so we're going to give everything, and that's all we think about, right?
Yeah, I think, and I talk a good game, but it's not like I've managed to put my ego to one side. It's always with me, kind of coming along for the ride. What sport does, and I think what it's best at, is helping us become aware of these things. So all this stuff is going to be happening in our subconscious, and what we want to do is make it conscious and bring it out and acknowledge it, so that we can train it and we can manage it, rather than having all this other stuff. It's like noise in your head that's causing you all this stress. If you're just aware of it, it's like, yeah, I went to the meet, I gave it a good shot, and I got my butt kicked a little bit, but it's all right. I can deal with that, and getting okay with the challenge of reaching for these ambitious goals and not hitting them sometimes. And swimming is a great sport for that, because you're not going to drop time every meet. It just doesn't happen. So there's these natural ups and downs, and there's these long plateaus sometimes, and it's just part of the sport, and everybody knows it. And so learning about that, and learning that you can overcome your plateaus with patience and by sticking with it, these are valuable skills that you can take outside of the athletic arena and apply in your broader life.
Talking about broader life and outside of athletics, I'd like to talk a little bit about you here, Gordo, for the rest of our time. One question that I had is, do you see any common personality traits that you hold that helped you with that transition from the business world, where you were very successful, and the elite sports world?
Oh, yeah. So, okay. I wrote something about this. So, I'm writing a book right now, and every strength that I have is also a weakness. And I'll give you one. I'll share a little story. So I'm very good at delivering my fitness to race day. I've blown up a few times, but I don't usually. I usually perform better than my training. So I'm saving my best for race day. And that is a really valuable skill to have for ultra distance, for any race 7 hours and up. Because of this gap we talked about earlier about how you'll feel later versus now. Most people underperform because they get excited in the first 3 hours, and they don't have physiology like Killian J, and who can recover while running around Mont Blanc. The rest of us just, and once we're done, we're done. So that's a strength. But in an event that's less than 2 hours long, not having the ability to just, when you're really fit, to just throw all your thinking out the window and just race, not having that skill to just ignore the consequences and go for it, can hold you back. It's difficult to win a race if you're trying to think through every scenario when the guy beside you is just racing. And that purity of focus So it can hold you back, being somebody who is a little bit too much of a thinker. So I think that that's something where it's kind of both sides. That would be a trait that I have. A trait that works for me as well is it's very difficult for me not to do something correctly. Now, correctly doesn't, there's no real right or wrong in most things. So I need to be careful with how I define correct. Because when I was younger, correct in an Ironman training sense was doing absolutely as much volume as was humanly possible. And I did a good job at my definition of correct, but my definition of correct could have benefited from this concept of a little bit of radical recovery and changing the game. So if you have a trait where you always want to play the game correctly, you need to be careful with how you define your game. And you have to define the game that you're playing with intent. And that's why my recovery matrix and the way I'm approaching things now has been very helpful, because it's giving me, I can play the game, but the game's not about managing my exhaustion. It's about managing my adaptation. So managing how I'm handling the training. And I think that's so again, the yin yang type thing, the strengths and weaknesses with both approaches would be sort of two examples of that.
If we talk about changing behaviors, which has to be at the center of any conversation for long-term performance, for someone who maybe didn't come up in an elite program, and putting the right things in place. We talked about sleep, we talked about nutrition, recovery. What is your approach when it comes to imparting change on someone's daily or weekly life?
Okay. This is the best part of working with an amateur athlete, hands down. So you work with an athlete who is already successful in their larger life. And that's a neat thing about triathlon. It attracts a lot of people and a demographic of folks that like the challenge, and they're already successful in another part. But they're coming to you, and so they're open to a new approach in their sport, whereas they might not be open to this new approach in their family or in their work. We've got them in a new domain, and they're feeling like, oh, I'm ready to learn some stuff. So that's great. So you've got somebody that's willing to listen. So here's what the coach does. The coach lays out a bit of structure. So it was the first part of our conversation. It was basically getting more out of the same amount of stress by reducing the right life stress and just organizing a bit better. They're surprised by this. They want to do more. They came to you so you could tell them to do more. It's like, no, we're just going to do better. Next step, I'm going to watch what they do. They know I'm watching. We all do better with someone watching us. And we're going to record. Now we can record most every session. So we're going to capture the data. Okay. And with that data, we're both going to make mistakes visible. So this happened. What were you thinking when that happened? And that's it. That's the coaching process, because the person already wants to get the result. And we've made mistakes visible. And we've got the overall background right. The person's and we just change a few things, and maybe I help them with some specific workouts and stuff so they learn how to train a bit. But when you're working with an elite, they already know how to train. So it's these smaller details, and it's making the mistakes visible and then figuring out, all right, we're going to iterate, we're going to change our approach a little bit, and we're just going to kind of keep shuffling towards better with that athlete. And that's what it's about. So it's about a little bit of structure, watching, making mistakes visible, and then adjusting and learning and moving forward. And then you just keep iterating along, ideally towards better.
One last question I have for you, Gordo. It relates to change as well, and more to you and how you approach change. You've had some tremendously significant transitions in your life from different professional worlds, different activities, and listening to you talk on another show, I felt a lot of serenity coming from you in the way that you approached and the way that you went through those transitions in your life. is that in hindsight, or was that already the case on the day? And if so, what helps you get through those big transitions with so much trust on what's on the other side?
Yeah. Endurance exercise. Endurance exercise helps me get through it. And I was talking to Johan. I listened to the Drive podcast that Niels did, and I'm listening to him, and I'm like thinking, that guy's got a vibe that sounds familiar. That's what I used to sound like when I was doing a lot of exercise. And there is something from doing a lot of endurance training that seems to settle my mind and help me in my larger life. And my life is better when I'm, and it doesn't need to be crazy amounts. I'm talking, well, it might seem crazy to somebody, but it's an average of about 2 hours a day, say. And if I'm getting my, so 60 hours a month of aerobic work, my life is better and I'm a lot calmer with that. So that helps. I think as well, the scariest transitions are probably the first ones in your life. Once you've done it a few times, you realize that you're going to be changing for the rest of your life. So it's actually not that big a deal. So, and that's what this stage of my life is about, because I promise you, there's somebody out there and they're feeling like in their work life or their training life that they need to make a change. That was the feeling I had, that this path that I was on was not working. And it was not working when I was working in finance. And it was also not working when I was at the top of the 40 to 44 age group, winning races all over the world. I was like, this isn't right. I don't like the direction. It's time for me to make a change. To that person, I would say, you can always come back. And so what I'm in the process of doing right now is, to the athletic community, is hopefully over the next 3 to 5 years, showing that you can come back. You can raise your kids. You can create a strong marriage and a wonderful household. And then when circumstances change, you can get back to, being a kind of slightly selfish, very focused, competitive amateur again, say something like that. So I hope I'm able to demonstrate that over the next couple of years to people, and they realize that these transitions aren't such a big deal. You're really just stepping back for a period of time. And when circumstances change, you'll be able to step back in if you want, if it's right for you at that future date.
It's just a game of patience and trust, I guess.
Yeah.
Gordo, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a real pleasure chatting with you. You talked about a book. When is that due?
Well, actually, starting January 1st,
okay.
feelthebyrn.substack.com. And if I reroute the URL of my existing blog over there, you get there with feelthebyrn.blog. But I'm going to write it digitally next year and just publish it in pieces on my Substack. And then what I'll do is, once it's done, then I'll go through the process of turning it into a paper copy. But I thought it would be, this year has been an experiment. I've been writing 2 blogs a week all year, and then combined with the 500 other articles that I had on my hard drive, I already have all the content. What I need to do is just pull it together. And I thought Substack would be a nice way to do that. Basically, you have different parts addressing the endurance athlete's journey and sharing more on these topics that we've been discussing over the last hour.
Well, that's fantastic. We'll make sure to put the link in the description for those interested in following your work. They can also find you on Twitter at, is it Feel the Byrn 1?
Number 1. And then Byrn is with a Y. My kids thought that up. So in the US, there was a political candidate, Bernie Sanders, and his thing was Feel the Byrn. And so my kids, when they go to a race, it's like, some people are going to be feeling the burn today. We're going to take it to them. And it's the only way people pronounce my last name correctly, because it's got a Y in it, but no E at the end.
It does make it easier when you say it, and then when you know this is how it's supposed to come out. Gordo, thanks again. It was a real pleasure. And I'll talk to you soon on Twitter or elsewhere. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.